Welcome to Dave Cooper Live, where we showcase the people, the products, and the processes that are building it better. Today, we are discussing the perfect partnership between AI and off-site construction. Together, we'll explore the latest trends in construction and technology and how we can merge them to tackle the most significant challenges in our industry. Off-site construction is paving the way for a faster, more cost-effective, and environmentally friendly future. But is it the ideal match for AI? Discover why off-site construction is the prime candidate for embracing AI in construction, revolutionizing the way we build. We'll also dive into the role of standardization in scaling off-site construction. Can we adopt lessons from other industries to enhance our practices? And let's not forget about the cyclical nature of construction and the consistent utilization factories require. Are there innovative solutions to bridge this mismatch? Our esteemed guest for today's live show is Lucas Carstens, founder and CEO of Modulize. So let's unlock the limitless possibilities of off-site construction together. So before we do that, though, we got to thank all of our sponsors because we cannot bring you any of these informative conversations without their support and all of your support out there. Forward Solutions Group is successfully driving companies to succeed where others have failed. Are you looking to start a factory, optimize your existing factory, streamline your production, or take your team to the next level? Whatever your needs are, Forward has a solution for you. Reach out to Ben at forwardsolutionsgroup.com. Halleck Ltd. has a long history of innovation in cold form steel manufacturing and producing innovative precision roll forming technology for customers throughout the United States and the world. Check out their machine buyer's guide for off-site modular construction or fast build construction with light steel for framing. Go to their website, halleckltd.com. All right, again, thank you to our sponsors. Please visit them and say hello and tell them Dave Cooper Live sent you. All right, let's hop into this. Without further ado, let's bring in Lucas. Lucas, how are you, my friend?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I am doing good. I appreciate you taking the time to be on the show. I know it's 7 p.m. where you're located or right around there. So we're going to get into this real quick. But first, we want to know everything about you from the moment you were born to the very moment in time. Don't leave out any good stuff from the hospital or we will have your mother on the show, and that might get embarrassing. However, you only have 2 minutes to do it. Go for it.
All right, I'll go right into it. So maybe I don't go like all the way back, but so all the way back almost. Originally from Germany, spent about 9 years in London, and now myself, as well as our company, we're based in Oslo, Norway. So I moved around a little bit. I actually did spend a year in the US as well. I was in West Virginia for a year when I was 16 going to high school. And then after I did my undergrad in Germany, studying cognitive science, I ended up going to London to do my master's. And as often happens with people moving to London, you like go there for a year and then it ends up 2 years and then it ends up 3. In my case, it ended up being 9 years that I spent in London after doing my master's in computer science, spent some time as a consultant, ended up going back to university, doing my PhD in AI and machine learning, actually. So hence these kind of connections that we're going to talk about. And then I worked at a big corporate called Thomson Reuters for a little while. And then after that, I ended up at a not-for-profit, actually. So one called the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, who fund international development projects primarily around climate change and child health. And there I was kind of like the techie in the place. So I tried a few different things before I ended up where we are today, which is in the startup world. And so I ended up moving from London to Oslo now about 3 years ago because my wife's Norwegian, and that's how it seems like a lot of foreigners who end up in Norway end up that way. So they somehow meet a Norwegian somewhere. Norwegians like to move back home at some point because Norway's a beautiful country and it's a pretty good place to be. So yeah, I ended up here about 3 years ago, right before COVID and right after Brexit. So it was an interesting time to move here. And yeah, I've been loving it ever since. So now building Modulize, our company, started that 2.5 years ago. So I'm sure we'll get all into how we ended up in this space. But as you can tell, not actually a background in construction, but yeah, I've always done something related to data, making good use of data, and figuring out ways, especially maybe in environments and places where things like AI, machine learning, and all those kinds of things maybe haven't had as much impact as maybe in a few other areas. So I think that's been something that I've learned to love, just figuring out how to use tech in places where it's maybe not as adopted as in some other areas, but where that, at least I think, also means that the opportunities are just massive. And yeah, so that's been now the last couple of years or so that we've been building Modulize. So went all the way from like academia to consulting, back to academia, corporates, not for profits, and now finally ended up in the startup world.
Well, you started in West Virginia, for goodness sakes.
Yeah, I was in Clarksburg for a year, so like 45 minutes south of Morgantown, which was pretty cool. So I was like 16, so I did my junior year in high school there.
Right, by Morgantown, West Virginia, and that's not a party place by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, Morgantown, I think, has a bit of a reputation, but Clarksburg, less
Not so
so.
much. Well, let's hop into it, Lucas. Why is offsite construction the perfect candidate to lead the way in adopting AI for construction?
Yeah, so I think what I realized, and it actually took me a little bit of time of really understanding and getting that into this industry, was there's a couple of what I think are pretty cool parallels when you think about like what does AI and specifically machine learning need and use, and when does it thrive, and when does offsite construction thrive? And a lot of it is basically when you think about machine learning and AI, it's all about patterns, right? And picking up patterns and making use of them and deriving value from that. And really, what at least I and we believe is that, and we'll get to like all of the standardization discussions and how that will help us drive efficiency and more adoption of offsite. But that's really, I think, where there is a lot of synergies and overlap, because one of the most important things that we can do, right, to help not just offsite construction scale, but also construction as a whole become more efficient and more productive, is leveraging patterns, figuring things out, how to take things that are repeatable and scalable and yet remain beautiful and useful and do all of the things that we want buildings and architecture to do, right? So I think there's some really cool synergies and parallels when we think about what makes AI and machine learning work and what makes it useful and valuable and produce beautiful things, and what is that like for offsite construction in comparison to all of construction. So I think that's really kind of the thing that like foundational parallel, I guess, that I see, which I think is pretty cool. And then we can build on that, right? And then really figure out, so how do we turn that into something real?
So maybe you could help us understand, to include myself, AI in general, very new.
Yeah.
Really, it's like the 2023, thing of the, tech of the year. AI came out, ChatGPT, all these things.
Exactly.
I don't think really people understand it yet. So, can you kind of like, is it going to take your job away? I guess is the question, Lucas. Everybody says AI will get so smart that we'll all be we'll be taking orders from our computers someday. But
Yeah.
in all honesty, though, how does it fit into what you're doing? And then it'll be great because we're going to show some demonstrations of what you're up to.
For sure, yeah. So, and it's a funny one actually, right? Because we're all about AI this year, basically, like end of 22, 23, chat, like you say, like ChatGPT was all the rage and continues to be all the rage. But AI as a thing has been around since the 50s, right? So basically, the first time that the term AI was like a thing was, I think, in like 1956. One of the big US colleges, there was a professor that was like, oh, let's figure out how to teach a computer language. And that professor thought that was going to be like a summer project, right? Because how hard can it be? Turned out it was pretty hard. And now what is it? 70 plus years later, there's this next wave, because we've seen these AI waves before, and now it's generative AI, right? And that's really it's super interesting and super cool because of the generative part, right? So you have different types of AI, different types of machine learning that solves different types of problems. So you have classification, right? Somebody gives you a text and says, oh, this text is about politics, this text is about movies. Then you have things like clustering. You try to group things into things that are somehow similar. And we've been doing these things for ages, right? You look at recommendation engines on Netflix. that's been a thing for ages. You have some form of machine learning underlying that.
Mhm.
But then when we talk about generative AI, what's so cool about it is, yeah, like we said, that generative part, right? That creates something new. And then now we're starting to see how good this actually is getting. And from just taking vast amounts of data in the case of ChatGPT, basically more or less the entire internet, right? So depending on which
Sure.
models you look at, and then captures all of that information, distills it into this model that then can generate new output from having built a model that has ingested all of that information, and then abstracts away from that, turns it into this what's called deep neural network. And it's basically just a bunch meaning billions of connections and parameters where you throw the input in, and then that builds up this ability to take and abstract away from what the algorithm has seen in the training data, which is basically all the text in the case of ChatGPT, and helps you produce new output. And now we're getting to this point where that's then connected to live data, right? Because now with ChatGPT, initially it was like up to 2021 or whatever the training data was up to. And now you have this model that can do stuff and then also taps into actually live data from the web. And now we get to do some really, really cool stuff with that. And that also drives just a ton of use cases. And then we see the same for images, but it's basically capturing a lot of historical data, identifying and capturing all of the patterns in some shape or form, and being able to then generate new output from that.
It's amazing to me. And how do you capture all this data? Do you have to put in the billion points of data into these systems, or is this something that's growing on the web that you can just kind of source a lot of this information?
Yeah, so there's typically a couple of steps to how you would do this. So what you would start with, and that's at the moment at least still super expensive, tons of compute power. So you like run like these clusters of servers basically somewhere in the cloud, sure, but it is still servers, physical servers, right? And some of the big models that, for example, I mean, one of the reasons OpenAI is burning this much money as they are currently is, one, they have to train these models, which for the big language models that OpenAI and ChatGPT are based on, it's in the orders of millions of dollars just to capture all of this data, then train the model, which is capturing all of the underlying patterns and basically building this or training this neural net, which is a bunch of neurons. Each of them has like a weight assigned to it, and that is a super expensive process. That's the training process where you build the initial model, and then what we do when as end users is you would then call that inference, or the generative step, right? Where you take the model that has been trained, and then when you actually ask ChatGPT a question, it doesn't have to retrain anything. The model is now trained, right? So then each query still consumes some data, but it's not like you have to train a big model from scratch. And then this other thing that people do is called fine tuning, because, and this is actually, and we can get into that as well, but so that's where a lot of people now think the real value will be captured, right? Because
Right.
GPT has kept like scraped all the data from the internet, but it's open, right? So in theory, everybody has that data, but then you can take this model that has kind of learned this generic representation of the world, and then you can fine tune it. Say you have some really cool proprietary data set, like say you're a health tech company and you have access to this data set that nobody else has access to. And then you can basically fine tune this algorithm that ChatGPT or that OpenAI have built, and then you can fine tune it to your own domain. And then it becomes particularly good at this one task. And we can then start to envision similar tasks for, say, construction, for example. So that's where, because with these smaller data sets that are, however, like very specific and only you have it, that's where a lot of people now see actually is going to be a lot of value creation that's going to happen.
Well, I appreciate the background on this. So Modulize itself, right? You consider yourself a marketplace. Explain that, and then let's get into what you actually do, and maybe we'll get to some of those demonstrations.
Yeah, for sure. So obviously we are talking about offsite construction, right? So I don't need to go too far back in terms of what that is, but basically what we're building is a marketplace for offsite construction, right? So what we saw when we started this was this massive opportunity with offsite construction, and however also there being some challenges that are real roadblocks in us thinking and talking about massively scaling offsite construction, right? And one of the big ones that we saw was actually basically the intersection between the contractors, the builders trying to adopt offsite construction, and the manufacturers who produce the building elements, produce the modules, be that timber frame, be that light steel frame, precast concrete, or full modules. So across the spectrum, really, we saw that there was a ton of friction with the contractors trying to figure out how to use offsite construction, and the manufacturers getting actually their product to the contractor. Because in Europe, but I think it's similar in North America and most other geographies, actually, there is this setup where offsite construction on the manufacturer side is mostly dominated by kind of SMEs, right? So they might be producing certain types of elements using one type of material. So say in Norway, there's a lot of timber frame manufacturers. And then as a contractor, especially as a kind of mid-sized or larger contractor, you might have a bigger project where you need timber frame walls, you might need precast concrete. You also want the bathroom pods, say it's a hotel. And then you have to go out and try and figure out who could be a good supplier, who could be the right supplier for this particular project. Maybe I've worked with them, with somebody else before, but they don't have the capacity, they're not a good fit. So and then the process, the whole tendering and procurement stage of a project is just a massive pain as well, because it's still super analog, lots of back and forth, emails, phone calls, SMS. And so what we're trying to do is basically build a stack of tools, both for the contractor and the manufacturer, to kind of manage and run their side of what's a typical kind of tendering and procurement process, and then connect those two, so that we basically connect each contractor for their project to a network of manufacturers on the supply side, that we can then figure out, okay, who's the best supplier for this particular project, so that we can really start to streamline and remove a lot of the friction that we see in the procurement stage, that gets to the point where we've seen tons of contractors that actually look at offsite construction and go, oh yeah, we know we should be figuring out how to use it, but this is too painful, so we're just going to stick to on-site, because we know what the numbers mean, we have historical data and all these kinds of things, that just there's so many reasons to then not make the jump. And that's really what we're focused on, so building the connective tissue between those two.
Perfect. All right, listen, everybody, if you are joining us, we are live on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and Twitch. So get your tweets on. And if you're not subscribed to our YouTube channel, you're wrong. You should be subscribed to it. And if you're not following Lucas and Modulize, again, you're wrong. You should be following them. We got a couple people out in the audience. We'll just say a couple quick hellos. D is joining us. Good morning from New Zealand. That's funny. We just talked about New Zealand before we started the show today, right? That's great. Man, I don't know if it's early or late there, but hopefully it's something decent. We got Maud. Look at that. We got good evening from India. Maud, thank you for joining us as well today. Henry Mickelberg. Okay, so he's going to be very interested to see if this is AI or supervised ML. So that's something we can get into.
Yeah, well, we can get into that discussion.
Yep. So we'll be able to get into that. I figured as much. We got George Ryman. Good morning from sunny and warming up Phoenix, Arizona. Warming up. What did it start off at 70 today, George? It's cold there, I guess, huh? So love it. Hey, and we got Sandoon. This is a very interesting discussion. I definitely agree that there's a very good opportunity to apply AI, ML, and data analytics and offsite construction related areas based on our 5 years of experience building software for this industry. Sandoon in Finland. All right, perfect. So we got people tuning in. Where do you want to start?
I'll let you take the lead. Do we want to talk a little bit more about, I guess, like super sexy topics, standardization?
Yeah, I think we should. So, really, what does, the role of standardization play in scaling offsite construction? And then I'm sure you're going to weasel in some of this AI and ML talk with it as well. So how does standardization play a part in this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit related, right, to some of the points that we already touched on. But obviously, offsite construction can do a lot of things, but when we talk about like scaling this whole thing, we need to also talk about a couple of different aspects of standardization, right? And I think we really want to look at two points when it comes to standardization. One, the standardization of the actual thing that we're building. So if we can, and this audience will know this, right? Because we're all about offsite construction. But as we get to a point where we can talk whether it's we call it mass customization or something else, right? As we get to a point of figuring out how to build things that are good quality, that are beautiful, but that are based on things that have some level of repeatability, right? If you're gonna have this building, maybe don't look at having to build wall elements that are, one is 11.2 meters wide and the next one is 11.4 meters wide, right? So having this degree of repeatability and standardization of the actual physical products that make up the building is one thing. But then the other thing, which ties in a little bit more with kind of the data side of things, so in the more in the digital space, is that we also, for us to really make this scalable and repeatable and use the power of data, then we also need to talk about standardization there. And one is adhering to and using standards. Like, for example, we talk about IFC as a format, which is super flexible for representing your 3D models. And sometimes it's a little bit too flexible, right? Because you can basically put in anything. So there's these efforts around standardizing what you can actually, what good practices look like for using IFC to represent 3D models. But then, and that's actually then almost throws us straight into one of the other topics that you mentioned at the start, which is around like learnings from other industries. One of the things that me coming into the industry was actually a little bit shocking was the lack of kind of driving towards open standards, because that's the added layer, right? So we can talk about standardization all day on the data side. If those standards get implemented based on closed ecosystems and closed proprietary formats, very quickly you get into trouble, right? And if you look at, for example, the banking industry, they've adopted open standards much more aggressively, and it just creates all this opportunity. So I think there's some really important lessons there and some really important points for us to, in this industry, actually get to a place where we can leverage data much, much more efficiently. So that's why I think there's really these two important discussions that need to be had around standardization. One is directly relating to offsite construction and the physical product, and the other one is it's a much broader kind of construction industry point, right? Because it's not just offsite construction that struggles with the adoption of standards, and also especially the adoption of open standards and like high quality and consistent adoption of that.
So with that, this is new to our industry, but it's not new to other industries, the standardization. No. And we talk about this quite a bit on the show. Are there learnings from other industries that we can adapt to the construction industry itself? Like, can you take what you were talking about with standardization, what's happened in other industries, and is that adaptable to our industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And I think the easiest example is actually banking, right? Where you have the kind of open banking standards, you have all of these kind of, even though you have the kind of channels like MasterCard has their own thing, Visa has their own thing, and then you have all the different big banks have their own systems, they still pretty much operate on a common protocol, right? So and that's, some of this actually has only happened in the last 5 to 10 years in banking as well, but you can now just build, fintechs have a much easier time than construction tech companies, right? Because they can plug into something where they know what they're plugging into. There's a clearly regulated way of a standard being implemented. It's not proprietary, so you don't create this lock-in, right? Whereas in our industry, maybe if you want to pick certain standards because they have the biggest reach, there is often comes with a degree of lock-in, right? And then you build, say, us as an early stage startup, it's pretty dangerous to tie yourself to a standard when it's a proprietary standard, because you have little to no insight into how that's going to evolve over time. Is it going to be supported in 5 to 10 years, right? So there's a lot, I think, with and like you can think about banking and finance what you like, right? But a lot of the things they've actually gotten right, and I think those lessons, I think, should translate into construction and the built environment in general, so real estate just as much.
Yeah, for sure. And for those of you that do not know the difference between AI and ML, we will cover that after we get through some more of the topics, right? Augmented versus machine learning is what it is, but I don't know if people really understand the difference. So it'll be a good conversation. So Henry, I didn't forget about you. We will get into that for sure. as this industry's, advancing, and we're trying to get that standardization, and we're trying to get that, cyclical factory consistency moving in the right direction.
Yeah.
Can we solve this mismatch somehow? Like how do the two come together?
Yeah, I mean that. So, and I guess the reason that we talked about this before the show is actually that is one of the things that we want to try. So as Modulize, try and contribute to, because so just for the context, right? So when we, and again, I think this audience is super aware of that, right? But when we look at construction, it's so cyclical, right? So it's everything's project based, but if you're going to operate a factory, cyclical is pretty bad, right? Because you have fixed cost, you have OpEx, that you have to run a factory. So that a lot of those costs don't go away just because the factory isn't producing anything, right? So the more stable you can get your utilization, and obviously with that, the closer that stable utilization is to 100%, the better. And then we can talk about, does 100% utilization mean 1 shift, 2 shifts, 3 shifts? That's, I think, on top of that. But that's the concept, right? You want consistent utilization of your factory, whereas the projects, they kind of come in on a project by project basis. And then on top of that, you often have the timelines that get the manufacturers into trouble, where you're in a place where 1 month you have too many projects. You have to actually say, okay, like we're at capacity now, and then 3 months down the road you're down to whatever percentage, but it's not 100, right? And so you have to somehow manage that. And what we, and I'm sure there's other ways in which we can try and figure this out, but what we want to try and do with building Modulize, and this goes back to building the marketplace, is create a large enough pipeline on both sides so that you can get to the point where for every project and every manufacturer, we think about it as project manufacturer fit, right? So to establish this project manufacturer fit and establish it at scale, so that you can at any given time say, basically plug into factory capacity when it's there in the most efficient way. So it becomes this optimization problem almost, right? But you can really only do that at scale. So that's why we think, and there'll be tons of other things that the industry as a whole needs to do to scale, but that's why we think building this marketplace dynamic has to be one of the major puzzle pieces, because we think that is, maybe there's other ways, but at least we think this is the clearest way in which we can start to kind of level this out and address this mismatch. Because if we have scale and lots and lots of projects on one side and a good amount of manufacturing capacity across different types of elements, across different materials, modules, if we can have those two and they're connected, then we can actually say, oh wow, there's a project coming in here, super good match for this cohort of manufacturers. Let's try and very quickly figure out who actually has capacity. But you never get to that if you as a contractor have 3 to 5 manufacturers that you know of, have worked with before, and you call them up, right? It doesn't work at that scale. It has to be much, much more scaled.
Yep. So I can see this working really well, right? In the commercial space, the apartment building space, what about single family? You're not here in the United States with this yet, but you guys are working across the pond, as we like to say. Are you seeing standardization happen? And is the consumer accepting that?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, and I think it's actually similar in the US, right? But maybe actually the differences aren't as big. There's a lot of geographical differences in Europe as well, right? So take Sweden, which has actually super high adoption of offsite construction in the residential sector, and that's across single and multifamily. It's around 80% actually of residential new builds in Sweden use some degree of offsite construction. In the UK, that percentage is in the single digits, right? So there's a big distribution in terms of how well this is adopted. And then actually on top of that, you also have some cultural norms that either make this easier or harder. So here in Norway, there's around buildings and homes, so especially single family homes, there's still a more deeply kind of ingrained culture around this individualism and building something from scratch without kind of pre-configured aspects. But that changes even in Norway when you go to cabins, because Norwegians love their cabins. And especially the new build cabins nowadays, a lot of them are modular or prefab. So I think it's happening, whether that's single family or multifamily, and maybe I could show a couple of just case studies to give a few examples of some of the projects that we've done so far, at least on the residential side. So maybe we could bring those up. So this is just like a few projects that we've done over the last few months. Where basically, so for context, this is where we work with a contractor who goes into Modulize, sets their requirements, says, here's the project. This is the part of the project that we're considering to do offsite. And then that gets sent off to our manufacturers who use Modulize on the supply side to basically get access to these projects and then create the bids for the projects and submit them back through Modulize. And you'll see, so it's kind of, it's a pretty interesting mix actually. So we've got these big multifamily kind of complexes. Here you see, so this was kind of a pretty large project, right over 5,000 square meters, facade elements only. Then the next one was like much smaller, multi-family, but pretty small, full wood element construction. And then this one's a bit hard to see, but you can kind of make out these grass-covered roof lines, and then the multi-family units at the back. Again, full wood element construction, more than 2,000 square meters. This one kind of multi-family, but so what's that? 9 units. But then we also, I think this one's pretty cool actually. So like looks awesome, right? And it's somewhere in it's in this like fancy ski resort area. So that's somewhere a little bit further up in Norway and has this big underground garage. But again, it's full wood element construction, right? So you have a pretty colorful mix of projects. So just to give an idea of what on the residential sector we're seeing in terms of projects, that at least most of these go all in on offsite.
Yeah, for sure. And they are beautiful. How do you get the factories to buy in to use your system?
So the approach for us was actually, and this was, I think even though we weren't from the industry, I think what we got right early on was to not try and come and say, hey, like your processes, they're all bad, they're all wrong, and you should do this differently, but rather look at people who really know their job. And in places, however, and they know this themselves, have certain inefficiencies, and they do like repeatable tasks that could be kind of automated away or streamlined, or through a better user experience we could make it a lot quicker. And so that was the starting point for us actually. Before we got into building the marketplace, what we did initially was to basically just build a tool that would take some of the work that the estimators inside the manufacturers need to do to put together their quotes. And again, this audience will know this as like quantity takeoff, cost estimation, so all the basics, right? But for us to build a tool that gets the basics right and doesn't try to say, hey, your workflows, they're all bad, you should do this totally differently, but rather say, we can take your existing workflows, make them a ton faster, and then integrate that with actually your relationship with your customers. So that was kind of the approach that we've been taking. And I mean, so far it resonates well, I think, because we're not trying to come in and say, hey, this is bad, but rather saying, hey, we can help you get this to be more efficient, and then actually hook it up to what's probably the most important part, right? Get more projects into the pipeline and then win those projects more easily as well.
So when a factory does, want to do this with you, do they start working within your system? And I know you're going to be able to show us a little bit of the inside of your process and your UI on this. But I'd be interested to know, like, are they using 2 different tools now, or is it integrated?
So what we're really seeing is that it's a bit of a mix, because like every manufacturer is different, every contractor is different.
Yeah.
For us, obviously, so we're still an early stage startup, right? So as we scale and continue to grow, obviously we want to build a fully integrated user experience that you really never have to leave a tool.
Sure.
And that's already true. So if at least for that particular workflow, where it goes from for the manufacturer receiving requirements, an RFQ, a tender request from a contractor, using Modulize to produce and send the full bid back to the contractor. In principle, the contractor with the manufacturer, with the tool now doesn't have to leave Modulize to do that. But then we are seeing a mix, right? Because everybody has their own like preferences and how they're working. So we're trying to be pretty accommodating, so that whatever the user's ideal workflow right now is, we'll still make that work. But from a functionality point of view, and then especially over time, for us to create the most value, it's really all about making sure that at least initially for this part of the workflow, you never have to leave the tool. So no kind of copy pasting into Excel, in and out of Excel sheets, no exporting attachments, putting it into this format and going back into that format. Then like that gets us back to the discussion around like closed and proprietary formats and all that kind of stuff, right? So that's really the experience that we're building or trying to build. And yeah, right now we're at that stage where we're seeing a little bit of both, where in some cases like, yeah, this just works, full adoption, let's go. And then in other cases, okay, like this works, I'm still like understanding this part, so I'm still going to do an export here. So we're trying to also keep that ability, right? Because we don't want to be like have this thing that works one way and one way only, because again, everybody has different workflows, different like underlying data. Some people have Excel sheets, the next user has an ERP system. So there are a lot of differences in that still.
Oh yeah, and it makes sense to do that, right? Because it's a big expense for people to switch out and change over. So I'm glad you're doing that. Why don't we take a look at the system, and then we'll go to a couple comments, and then we'll talk about AI and ML, and we can wrap it up from there.
Sounds good. So what I did was I just took a little screen grab of just a couple of pieces of functionality, right? So this is just going to cycle through because I didn't want to do like a full demo. So obviously, if you want a full demo, you'll know where to find me. But
there's one coming up on LinkedIn.
Yeah, exactly. So now what we're showing there is it's the manufacturer's view, right? So basically it's you as a manufacturer, and this is based on drawings, and you basically want to do your takeoff, but also your cost calculations. And so the workflow here would have been that you basically have an inbox for projects, which we could also show. But so you have an inbox for projects that contractors have posted onto Modulize, basically. Then you pull that tender or that RFQ, very quickly create kind of a project in your workspace. And then we have a bunch of functionality around what we call auto marking, right? So you basically, in this case, using the floor plan, you automatically identify outer walls, inner walls, windows, doors, those kinds of things. Then we have this 3D preview as well, that as you continue to build up your calculations, you can always sense check that against 3D. You can also introduce things like gavel walls, which you'll see here. And then workflow wise, so this also automatically translates into the cost. So each of these categories that you'll assign the walls to, in this case, has kind of some parameters associated around the material makeup of the wall, what's the price of each of the material layers, so on and so forth. So it's basically, the idea is that, yes, this is takeoff, but it's building this much more automated and kind of workspace-based workflow where you don't have to go through these sequential steps, but rather as you build up your calculations, you're immediately also creating the bid itself. So by the time you're done with the calculations, you can export if you want, but the alternative is just that once you've built up the calculations, you're basically ready to submit back to the contractor who has set the requirements in the first place. So just to kind of give a very, very quick idea of that. So it's really all about taking processes that people already do today. So we're not trying to make up something new, and like we said earlier, try to convince people to do their work all differently and start from scratch, but rather take it, make it seamless, make it automated, and connect it directly to the customer.
So it not only is helping with the design and picking what factory it's going to go through, it's giving you a complete workflow, RFQs, quantity takeoff, like it's doing all that, cost calculations, bid comparisons, everything.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. And how's it getting the bid comparisons from the factories?
Yeah, so exactly, because what we do is, so because you have these two sides, right? So this is now the work that the manufacturer will be doing. Right. They would then submit their bid, but manufacturer two has gone through the same workflow with their element categories, their wall types, and their calculations. So they use the same tool, submit the bid in the same structure and format. That's back to standardization, right? So we make sure that by the time the bids get to the contractor, it's not like one PDF attachment here, an Excel sheet there, and a phone call over there, but rather that it's basically like, when you buy an iPhone, right? You put the 3 models side by side and you go like, okay, this looks right. So that's kind of the experience that we want to build out, right? Because we know that also from a contractor's point of view, that bid comparison is super painful, right? Especially if you have this PDF and then you have the next PDF, and everybody has their own structure and their own format. So where do you even start? Transport included, transport excluded, certification here, certification is on page 15 down there. So that's kind of the situation that is mostly the reality. So that's then part of the point of building this end-to-end system, right? That we don't have to like tell people, oh, stick to the standard, but because people are using the same tool, inherently you're going to stick to the same standard.
So who's the customer here? Is it the factory? Is it the architect? Is it a designer? Is it an engineer?
Yeah. So right now it's the contractor. On the contractor side. So the customer is the customer of the manufacturer is also our customer, and that's typically either, and that depends on what the kind of org structure of the contractor is. So that could be either procurement lead or the project lead, right? If the project lead does the procurement themselves, then they would also do this. So it's typically one of the two. And then the other customer, because we have this two-sided marketplace, is the manufacturer, right? And they basically pay to get access to the tool, but the tool then also comes with this inbox of projects and the ability to pick off the projects, use the tool to create the bids and submit the bids back to the contractor. So there's two customers right now.
And could I have something drawn and imported into your system?
Not by us. So we're really focused on processing and automating the processing of the drawings. We also have some level of functionality for 3D, but we haven't really developed it very far, because what we've actually seen, and I don't know how true that is, but I think it is pretty true across different continents, is that during this procurement stage, people for most projects avoid the IFCs, the BIM models, the 3D models, because they're typically not at the level of quality and maturity that you would be able to rely on them. So typically when it comes to tendering and take quantity calculations during this early stage of a project, most people stick to the floor plans. So that's also what we're facilitating. So at this stage, we're not trying to let people design stuff inside Modulize. That's not the focus. So the focus for now is really streamlining and automating the calculations and the RFQ and the bid production.
Awesome. All right, let's go to a couple more comments that came through. Peter Molinar, what's up, Peter? Is there an existing organization, or does a new one need to be created to establish, monitor, standardized building practices? Yeah, I mean, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a very, very good question. There is one organization called Building Smart, which has like these international chapters, and they're like the steward of IFC. So this IFC is the format, the open source format for representing and capturing 3D models, right? So Building Smart, I would say, is probably the closest to that. And they're doing a lot of work, which I think is super important. To be fair, I'm not involved, so I don't know what the status of it is, but they're doing work around so IFC is already the standard, but because it's so flexible, you can like we said earlier, you can kind of throw in anything you want. So they're also doing work to basically help build best practices around how we use IFC and make that actually the default, the workable default for all of these situations. So see, our hope would be that we do all of this in 3D at some point, but most of it today still happens in 2D. But so I think Building Smart would probably be the closest to that kind of organization.
That'd be interesting to see how they're doing that, how it's structured, and is it something that's repeatable in different countries, you know? For sure. You had a follow-up. And are these prefabricated buildings assembled with techniques and materials to meet high performance standards?
Yes, is the clear answer. At least I guess you should work with somebody who knows what they're doing, right? But I think outside of that, the answer is, or assuming that the answer is definitely yes. So what we actually see, and this is a little bit, like offsite construction is still a little bit getting over its own reputation, right? Like post World War II, like boxy things that are not great. And on average nowadays, if you compare, say, the energy standards, the quality of things that are built offsite versus onsite, offsite actually wins. So we've gotten to the point where offsite construction, again, on average, assuming people know what they're doing, the quality is higher. So now it's really just a matter of perception and reputation of that way of building.
Well, I think everybody just needs to take a trip to Sweden.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? 80%. All right, I know you're still out there, Henry Mickelberg. At least I hope you are. Let's get into some AI and ML. Is it an AI platform, or is it an ML platform, or is it both?
Yeah, in the case of Modulize, I want to say it's neither, because I don't want to like oversell what both we and what the industry as a whole can do at this point. So for us, what we do is we utilize some of these pieces of functionality so you saw this like auto marking piece, right? And then we can do like bit summarization or tender summarization, which is then based off of these large language models. So we think there are, at least for our workflow, there's very concrete pieces of the work that we can automate using ML, AI, and we can then get into the distinction of the two or how they relate. But so in the case of Modulize specifically, it's not that we're presenting what we're building as this like futuristic magic box that you just throw something in and magic comes out and it's all just happens by itself. It is really much more about finding the best practical applications of the ability to use machine learning, use AI to automate parts of these steps. So that's for Modulize. And then if we go into the AI versus ML discussion, right? So these terms get used, I guess, almost synonymously. And I guess the easiest way of putting it is that machine learning is a subset of AI.
Right.
And the AI that we so the AI that we talk about today is basically all machine learning. And then there's different types of machine learning. So there's supervised learning, unsupervised learning, semi-supervised learning, reinforcement learning. And then there is other parts of AI that really mostly used to be a thing are less of a thing now. There's some categories there. There's like things like symbolic AI. So that's basically or like based on building logic formulas and then making them talk to each other. So there's a bunch of AI fields that aren't really kind of in the spotlight at the moment. Most of it is machine learning based. And then we talk about these different types of machine learning. And then, for example, the way that large language models work, so that's like your chat GPT, it's usually a combination of algorithms where, for example, and I think the question was around supervised learning, right? So supervised learning means you take a data set and then you label the individual pieces of the data set. And then you train the algorithm trying to connect the data with the data label and then define the patterns based on that. So that means, I don't know, you take customer reviews on Amazon, right? And then the labels would be the star ratings. And then that's your training set. Then you say, for you basically pick up patterns. What does a 5-star rating look like from the like text that is used? What's a 3-star rating look like? And then you take tons and tons, millions and millions of Amazon reviews, and then you do supervised learning where you pick up these patterns that match the 3 stars, the 5 stars, the whatever. And then when there's a new review that comes in, you say, okay, this looks like a 3-star review. That's basically like very simple, but that's basically supervised learning. You can't do that when you're building a large language model because you can't really like annotate or label the internet, right? It's just too much data. So what something like ChatGPT model is, it's a combination of approaches where some of it is unsupervised or semi-supervised or self-supervised, where you have like a partial labeling or the data isn't labeled at all. So you're just really looking for patterns and then you're trying to map those onto something. And then earlier we talked about this fine-tuning step. That's then often where you use these really, really big data sets that build the language model that is more generic and not fully supervised. And then you use your own smaller data set, which might have labels because say it's, I don't know, that's then more for images and not for text, but say it's like breast cancer mammography images, right? And they're labeled because a doctor has looked at them. And then you can train the algorithm based on that labeled data with a supervised approach. So typically it's all about, with these big modern approaches, it's really all machine learning, but it's different approaches to machine learning. Like reinforcement learning is a third class. That's a pretty big part of how these models work today, which is basically taking then into account feedback as people use it in this case, right? Because you as a user might say, hey, this answer made sense. And then you can reinforce the classification approach by saying, oh, this was actually a bad answer. So let's take that data into account so that you have this continuous learning loop as well. So that's really, I think, the quickest way maybe of running through that, where machine learning is a subset of AI and machine learning can be broken down into these different approaches as to how you would do machine learning.
Henry, you had label data. All right. Greg Ugoldi in the house too. Holy cow, Greg. Good to see you. Greg, if you don't know who Greg is the past chair of the National Association of Home Builder, the guy that updates President of the United States a couple times a year on housing. So he's even tuning in, and he has a question. Why does Lucas require everything that is submitted for AI to be at scale?
It's a good question if I understand it the right way. So there's a couple of ways. So at scale, so we talked about the at scale of like using offsite construction at scale, right? So I think that's one for us to be able to scale offsite construction. I think is pretty important to address some of the challenges that the built environment as a whole faces, right? Whether that's housing shortages, labor shortages, or all those things. But if we talk about AI and scale together, the way that modern machine learning works is at scale, right? So the way that basically all successful approaches to AI/machine learning work today is by using massive data sets. So that's why in the context of the AI discussion, we talk about scale. That being said, what's happening now is kind of this, we're reaching this like edge of what we can achieve with scale, at least for the language example, because when you train an algorithm on all the corpus of all of the internet, there's only so much that you can go bigger on, right? You can, I don't know, twice the internet, I don't know. Right. So what people are trying to figure out now is how can we actually build smaller models that have the same performance? And that's actually like a little bit then going against that scale, right? But then we're talking about, okay, maybe we don't have 400 billion parameters, maybe we only have 200 billion, right? So it's not like we're still at scale, but that's something that people are trying to figure out now. How can we get the same performance without having to go like just bigger and bigger and bigger? Because at some point you reach like a threshold where it's difficult to go bigger and increase the performance by just throwing more data at it. But that's really like, I would say when we talk about scale in the context of AI, it's because most of these machine learnings just to work today, they rely on scale and massive amounts of data.
I love it. Lucas, we're out of time. Did we forget to talk about anything? Is there anything that you want to mention? Here's the website as well, so people know how to get a hold of you and what to go see. But did we miss anything?
Yeah, no, I think that was pretty good. I think we covered quite a lot of ground. I guess the only thing that's maybe left to say is that do find us if you want to learn more about Modulize, right? So modulize.com, lucas@modulize.com, pretty easy to find. So I always love to talk to people in offsite or people who are looking at offsite, right? So we just think it's a super important space. We all need to work our best to help figure out how to do more of it, because it just helps. It will help us solve a lot of the challenges that we have in construction. So
it definitely will. Awesome, man. You did an amazing job. I hope everybody appreciated what they got to learn today. It is mind-boggling when you start talking about billions of, points of data. Like, it just doesn't even register with me. I can't even keep track of my daily schedule. So good thing there's smart people like you guys in the world. All right, listen, everybody, that's a wrap for today's show. Be sure to tune in this Friday for BS Friday. We will see you at 1 p.m. Make sure you go and check out our sponsors as well. Lucas, don't go anywhere. I'll come back to you after the outro. And for the rest of you, here's some more sponsors. Please say hello and say thank you and tell them Dave Cooper Live sent you. What an amazing show. Thank you to all of our sponsors for helping us to continue to bring all of these innovative conversations to all of you out there. Please visit them, see what they have to offer you. And as always, subscribe to the YouTube channel and ring that bell. It would mean the world to us. I'm Dave Cooper.